I'll go now over a number of slides to come to the new setup of economic policy as it is organized in Europe. In Europe, we have a Europeanized, centralized monetary policy, fiscal policies organized, coordinated by the Stability and Growth Pact, and we have decentralized incomes policy. So this is a rather different policy setup from what you have in a national context. It's at least completely different from what we had in the German case. And Europe has been rather innovative in terms of defining new policy processes. There's quite an amount of coordination going on. Broad economic policy guidelines, all the processes which at the end of the day, and I understand that Demos Europa is also working very intensively on the Lisbon process. All these processes are basically about the coordination of monetary policy. In other words, if you're in that mechanism, your leeway to behave differently will be reduced. And one of the core parts of this program is, of course, the Stability and Growth Pact. And what the finance minister said would, to be very frank, would lead in the European, in the German case in particular, to a very heavy debate. So what one largely wants to organize with the Stability Growth Pact is to prevent public budgets from becoming destabilizing for the partners within the system. It's largely about reining in spillover effects, and that's why it's important. Let me just give you in 2 minutes what EMU has achieved since its introduction. Consumer price inflation went down rather strongly before monetary union. Afterwards, it was largely at the level which one wanted to see, but what you see here also is a dispersion in terms of inflation rates. And this is a problem I'll come back to later on. What we saw with monetary policy is, of course, that all those countries which had high inflation rates as a result of that uncertainty about the exchange rate had to pay a quite significant exchange rate premium. Now, Europe-wide, we have a common policy rate. A consequence of the dispersion between inflation rate and common monetary policy, common interest rates, is, of course, a dispersion in real interest rates. I'll pick that up in a minute also. And now, what are the challenges coming out of the crisis which are now leading us to new questions very rapidly? We saw financial markets completely misbehaving, becoming very dysfunctional. Here you see the spreads between secured and unsecured money, which used to be 6 basis points and went up dramatically. This is the environment of Lehman, AIG, and so forth. So markets became completely dysfunctional. And I do think the ECB responded to that environment quite effectively. It diagnosed early on the crisis as a run on liquidity, a systemic liquidity issue, and added substantial amount of liquidity early on. And you see here the environment of the Lehman shock, autumn 2008. Why do I highlight that point? I do think the ECB, the European System of Central Banks, has done a rather good job in responding to the crisis. Now, what are the challenges in 3 minutes? The challenges are Europe is rather heterogeneous, in particular in terms of its financial markets. You have markets which are largely bank-oriented and others which are much more capital market-oriented. I put up the case of Germany, which relies very heavily on banking, and the French economy, which over the last 20 years has gone much more towards a capital market orientation. Out of this variety, heterogeneity, arise problems, in particular for monetary policy, where the transmission mechanism of monetary policy responds differently depending on the environment. What I'd like to point out here is European monetary policy cannot care for the German environment. It cannot care for the, sorry for that, Polish environment. It only will be a policy which is attuned to the average economic environment as such. Now, policy challenges. The finance minister alluded to all the topics with regard to financial market regulations. I won't go into that. We do have challenges now upcoming in terms of going out of the temporary, unprecedented policy devices which we used in monetary policy, which we used in fiscal policy. And these are my three final remarks. We also have now, on the market side, a different understanding of how the European monetary system works. Here you see the spread of government bonds, 10-year bonds, over German government bonds. They used to be all over the EMU phase very low. In fact, Italy on average had over the last 5 years a spread of only 25 basis points. As a result of the crisis, they shot up dramatically. And you see, by the way, the same happening with Polish bonds also. So markets are now looking from a different angle at European developments. Why? And that's a point I'd like to underline. We see tensions building up in Europe, and that's an issue which has to be addressed. Germany has been, in German eyes, behaving. Here you see unit labor costs. In fact, if you would put it in an economic context, you would say there was a real effective depreciation of the German euro, which meant higher competitiveness. You saw other countries where unit labor costs increased dramatically. What was the result of that? Now we see in Europe, and I just highlight the case of Spain and Germany, Germany green, Spain turquoise, if you like. You see now current account deficits in Europe widening out. And this is an issue which will be difficult if, and here I'll come back to the initial remarks about functional equivalence, if there's no response with regard to the functional substitute for the nominal exchange rate mechanism. And in this case, it has mainly to do with an adjustment of real exchange rates. Final point. I do think it's important to have a debate, an enlightened debate here in Poland about the appropriateness of entering monetary union. It should be, first of all, start with the economic arguments. And one of the most important arguments is about the substitute for giving away the nominal exchange rate mechanism. And if one gives it away, where one has to create initial stability. I always like to quote a French author at the end of such an event. Paul Valéry in Tel Quel once said, "We hope vaguely, but we fear precisely." I do think we could reword that we hope precisely and only fear at the margin. There's good reasons to be constructive here. Thank you so much for your attention.